So welcome to this evening's Dharma study time. We're going to be talking about the 8 limbs of yoga with a special passionate focus on the Yamas and the Niyamas. And we'll start with a period of sitting quietly together. While we sit quietly, and since we've come together for a common purpose, even though you may have your eyes closed, even though your attention may be inward, I'd encourage you to feel the presence of others who share intention and practice and the loyalty to this tradition we call yoga. Though you have your eyes potentially closed or cast down, and though you can experience the breath in the nose and the belly, you may have the sensations of your body making contact with the ground. I'd like you again to sense the companionship you have in the room. You don't need to tell a story about that companionship. We're not making evaluations, judgments. Just listen to how it is in your body and your brain, your mind and your heart, to know that you have companions on the path of awakening. As you sense this companionship, which is actually infinite and beyond measure, you may ask yourself now what you would like to contribute to the awakening of others. How would you like most to be in relationship? What offering might you like to make? With appreciation for the opportunity and even really the responsibility that we get to contribute to the awakening of others, please bring your palms into Anjali Mudra. And bring your attention back into your own heart and acknowledge, while you've been considering the presence of others, there are 30 people considering your presence as well. And on your behalf, they make an offering to your awakening. We'll chant in call and response, and in the most brief sense, what we're saying is, may good things happen. The literal translation I'll share with you after we chant. So I'll sing the call and the response with you. Om Asatoma Om Asatoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma bow your head to your heart. As you're ready to do so, you can release your hands and open your eyes. So what we're chanting there is a mantra that says, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from forgetfulness or ignorance into luminosity or clarity, and also from the bitter to the sweet, or the finite to the infinite. It's a chant that's widely sung, and my teacher in Rishikesh sings it in the Vedic rhythm that you're hearing it now. This is her translation, her methodology. So I wanted to start with our sitting practice to be aware of the otherness in our companionship, in our community. And I'm going to tell a little story, and then I'd like to know from you how this brief meditation was. And the story, I'm compelled to tell you, it arose for me while we were sitting in silence, so I'll share it with you. We are about to graduate 12 adults in custody who live on the inside of a prison to become certified yoga teachers here in the States. That's with the Yoga Alliance. It's maybe a national or international organization. They just finished their program. They're going to graduate on March 26th. And we were training them to teach yoga to other adults in custody who have developmental delays and what we would call neurodiversities. They're on the autism spectrum, they're on mental retardation spectrum, they might have mental illnesses, they have developmental delays and sensory motor differences. So those guys who live on the inside, I've said to my community before, so some of you are hearing it again, they are the most easily exploited adults in custody in the system. Partly because the way their brains are working, they are the most eager to please somebody else. They are eager to please and have connection and relationship and to have a friend. So the understanding of who to please and who to say yes to and when to say no, the clear boundaries that would be needed on the inside, they don't have a way to read that process. And partly that's how they end up in criminal activity in the first place. They're not likely to strategize those things on their own. So they end up in a circular process in the prison because they commit a crime, they are incarcerated, they live on the inside, they get accustomed to that, they finish their sentence, they go back out, and if they haven't changed their ability to know to whom should I be loyal, they can go back to the same circumstances repeatedly. So we see a cyclical process here. I don't know how this is in Canada. I don't know the system up there very well. But this is part of the dilemma that we face in the DOC, Department of Corrections here in this country. So our guys are being trained to teach yoga to those guys. And we were asking the students for several weeks, if you were to consider a familiar, habitual, and unhelpful thought, a mental pattern that you know you have repeatedly, but you also know is not helpful to you, if you consider that thought getting displaced by another more helpful, more skillful thought, what might that more helpful or skillful thought be? I didn't ask them to say what the unhelpful thought is because we could go widely astray into talking about where that came from and why they have the unhelpful thought and so on. And a lot of us have unhelpful thoughts. I mean, do you have unhelpful thoughts from time to time? And are your unhelpful thoughts generally repetitive, even if they change the names and the dates? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we were asking them, how might you usurp the space that the unhelpful thought normally occupies by including a more auspicious, more hopeful thought? So on the day that we were going to ask our, let's say, we call them our guest students, the developmentally delayed students, we're going to ask the guest students how they might replace one thought for another. They had the yoga practice and we asked them the question, and I turned to one student who was off to my left over here, and I asked him, so what thought might you use to replace an unhelpful thought? And he looked at me, as he's done for months, and he said, I don't know. And I looked back at him and I said, I've heard you say, I don't know, many, many times. And he said, I don't know. And so when I was interacting with him, he was repeating the behavior of, I don't know, which is his most common thought phrase vocalization. So the guy next to him, who's also a guest student, he says to this student, "You can say, 'I'm a good friend.'" And the student, he looked at his companion, he said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, for how many times you've said, 'I don't know,' if you were to say, 'I'm a good friend'? Things might happen that you can't anticipate right now." And he said, "I don't know." And so his friend said, no, you can say, "I'm a good friend." And so he encouraged him about 3 times, and I stayed with the student until he was able to say out loud, "I'm a good friend." And to actually find the new muscles in the mouth and the vocal cords at the pharynx and the larynx and the tongue and the brain and the mind and the heart that could say, "I'm a good friend." And when he said it, his companion friend, who's probably in the same unit he is at the prison, lit up, and he told him to say it bigger. This particular friend is very animated. His neurodiversity is a really animated, very hopeful expression. And he says, no, say it louder. You can say it louder. And there's 30 people in the classroom, and so he repeated it a little bit louder. "I'm a good friend." And you could see his body posture changed, and his affect was changed, and he became present with the people around him and also with me. And he didn't go back to, "I don't know," for the remainder of that afternoon. I don't know what happened when he left the class, because I don't get to follow up that intimately. But it's the process. When you hear me tell the story, are you hopeful for the guy who says, "You can say you're a good friend"? You feel lit up by his affect when I talk about him. And for the guy who says, "I don't know," what kind of response did you have to him while I was first telling the story?
I felt sad.
Yeah.
And deflected.
Deflected. You felt pushed away, and you felt sad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Felt like I needed to reach out more.
Uh-huh. You wanted to help him more.
I wanted to help him more.
Yeah. Anything else arise? Anybody feel helpless when he says it 5 or 6 times? I don't know. Yeah. You can sometimes experience helplessness in our human communities too. And when he was lit up by his friend's phrase, when he said it and his affect changed, and I'm reflecting that also, did you feel yourself change too? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you maybe feel more hopeful? Mm-hmm. Anybody experience relief?
It's like a happy ending. That period of the story.
Yeah, it's a more happy ending. The experience you might have had of relief right there in your system is worth noting. You might not have realized if you were holding tension, but you can realize when you experience relief. Sometimes we don't know we're holding tension until we experience the relief of the tension. So as you hear the narrative, of course some of you are here for yoga teacher training, and so this is a teacher training story from the Department of Corrections down in Salem. As you hear the narrative, your brain is lighting up with what I'm talking about, and your empathy circuits get turned on. Or your overwhelm and helplessness circuits get turned on. That's a different part of your brain than your empathy circuits. You may have them kind of cooperating right now. And the question we were asking earlier today is, which part of the brain then do we soothe and which part do we encourage? So if you went to overwhelm or helplessness primarily, you're likely in the limbic and lizard brains getting anxious. And even the desire to help can sometimes be the desire to escape our own discomfort. Like, I want that person to feel better. I want this, I don't know, character to kind of get it. So that can be to alleviate our own discomfort, or it can be from the empathy circuits themselves. Like, here we are experiencing the part of us that might have said, I don't know. And our empathy for that in ourselves may generate our empathy for that in this student. When you hear the other student he's so expressive, he's so into his friend being a good friend. I'm not certain he could define what that means beyond the most basic things about good friend, because of the neuromaturity of their brains. but he's so committed to his friend knowing that he's a good friend. And when I'm talking about that, you can feel the joy part of your brain light up too. So we inherently have social brains, and though our yoga ancestors didn't speak about this, they didn't dissect the brain, they didn't have a cadaver lab, they didn't have real-time MRIs, there was something that they knew about our social brain networks. They knew it instinctively. So let me back up to a few minutes ago when we were sitting in meditation, and I asked you to feel the presence of the others in the room. How was your experience of that? And I'd like to know, I'd be honored to hear you say more than nice.
Warmth.
Mm-hmm. You experienced warmth? Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it would focus on me, and all of a sudden I wanted to like reach out
Mm-hmm.
and say, okay, come on in.
Yeah. Less focus on yourself and more sense of this. Yes.
It was easier to focus.
Your meditation was easier.
I stayed with my train of thought a little more than if I was to think about breathing. Oh, I'm inhaling down.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the external was very helpful.
It actually focused your meditative presence more for you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It provided an object in a way.
Mm-hmm. The object onto which to rest your attention.
Yes. But I just felt such expansiveness. I just loved it. It's just like everything kind of emanated out like this, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That's-
Yeah. Yes.
Felt like the energies kind of all came together at that moment. I don't know, I'm very like, I feel my inner energy and it just kind of like expanded and was like touching others.
Hmm.
It's cool.
Mm-hmm. It's nice. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think I get some kind of fundamental, like relief that cuts through all the other challenges, other bad idea and all this stuff, and what we're just down to fundamentally people that are really interested in waking up and helping each other wake up, and
Yeah.
but hit some truth that's bigger than.
Yeah. I like the phrase you started with that sort of cuts through all the other stuff. And there's a realization and a kind of clarification about this opportunity and the people who are committed to waking up. Those who are not yet committed may not know it's available. So without judgment, we see the luck in a way that we have to be interested at all. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I could feel like spiritual bodies, kind of energy points, is how I imagined it. And it was interesting because, like, if I try to be aware of everybody by myself, it's different than if everybody is kind of meeting at the thing. All the minds are meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of felt like, suddenly all of our spiritual bodies are gathering all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So another question I have before I shift into why this is relevant for tonight, and I'm going to ask a raise your hand question for a moment. When you were sitting and I was recommending to feel the companionship in the room, how many of you, while you were doing that, included yourself in the companionship? Okay, a small handful, relatively. That's about 30%. And how many of you experienced your presence as being on behalf of the others? Mm-hmm. That's about 30% as well. What were the other 30% experiencing? You don't know. The question I'm leaning toward is that sometimes we've organized ourselves as a person who gives to the other, and the dropping the sense of self happens quickly, rapidly, and not always skillfully. Like you forget that you also exist in that companionship, that you're one who gives, but you might forget that you're also a receiver. You know, you're a transmitter and you're a receiver. And then others of us, we learn to know where we are and to hold that sense of self while connecting. Because both of those are helpful mechanisms that we developed much earlier in life. We may be orienting and then refining those now as we practice yoga. I'm someone who learned to be hyper aware of the other, to make sure that I could navigate the possibility of harm. This is from my early life environment. I had to know. I'm also an identical twin, so I was intensely aware of the other probably from conception. We shared an embryonic sac, and that's a pretty intimate deal. I don't have any cognition of that, but in terms of like the actual experience of me, but I've got scientific understanding now. But to be aware of, vigilant about what might happen in the environment meant to be less preoccupied with myself and more occupied with this. And that's how I walked into the path of yoga, on behalf of others. And I had to learn through the practice of yoga to orient myself in my body also, to have a place. Like Mary Oliver says, a place in the family of things. So it's been a benefit to me. My orientation has created service programs and so on and so forth, but it's been a benefit to also remember this needs nourishment if that's going to happen. And whatever strategy you developed in early life becomes a strategy that it's hard to see it exists because it's so familiar. We don't know that we're looking through the stained glass window of our conditioning until we start seeing new things and beyond the conditioning. And that's partly the practice of waking up in community, and it's certainly the practice of yoga, to see beyond the conditioning, to recognize that conditioning happened. And yoga isn't just asking us to more thoughtfully organize our conditioning. Sorry. Is asking us to move beyond the conditioning into realization of our infinite and indwelling nature. So with that in mind, somehow our ancestor yogis knew the value of first limb of yoga is on community. The yamas are about the precepts, the responsibilities we have to the other, which I think is so phenomenal that they knew the value of this. And I've said this before in Dharma talks, but it's worth saying again, because we are living in the West where yoga is rapidly increasing in its particular patterning, you could say, its particular samskars as a yoga community. And people are fixated with asana. I would say that a high percentage of people now practicing yoga who are actually practicing asana don't know that yamas and niyamas exist, that they haven't been introduced to the system of yoga, they've been introduced to asana, which is great, because asana can be a wonderful doorway for transformation and awakening and changing your health and experiencing new ways to think, sense, breathe, and move. It's phenomenal. But what also happens when we mostly practice asana in our culture is that we go to the yoga mat to clean up the messes we've made in the body or the mind or the relationship or the life or otherwise. We go kind of to repair the imbalances that we've created. We go to feel inspired, we go to feel connected and so on, but if we don't have the life responsibilities established, if we live chaotic lives or lives that are not so ethical, we go to the yoga mat to repair the life, and we feel tremendously better. We say, yoga works. And then sometimes we go back to the substances, behaviors, thoughts, activities, and lenses that we're looking through, and we repeat. We build the same residue of stress, and we go back to the yoga class, and we kind of reconcile the stress for that day, and that feels a lot better. We might sleep better that night. We may speak more kindly that afternoon or that evening. But if we don't change the underlying patterns, we go back to the same habits, the same thoughts, the same speech, the same actions. We create a residue again. We go back to the yoga mat and we feel tremendous again. Well, our ancestor yogis were recommending the first step of yoga, the first limb, is the yamas. Clean up how you're living in community with other people. So you know the character from Charlie Brown, who has his name is Pigpen, I think. Is this right? Yeah, so he's taking his stuff with him as he goes. This is like, yeah, he's like that little cloud is following him around, right? Am I got the right character here? Yeah, so he's doing the Pigpen routine. He was designated as the character. So he didn't practice the Yamas and the Niyamas very well. He didn't clean up his relationships, so he's still carrying that around. And it's kind of like our imperative to do that before we come to the yoga mat. So that when you come to the yoga practice of asana, pranayama, and pratyahara, and so on, you're actually gaining ground. You know, you're coming not to repair, but to stabilize in and then gain ground on the path of yoga. You know, your elevation gains are tremendous. But if we're mostly in the undertow of what's not in balance in our lives, can somebody get the front door, please? If we're mostly in the undertow of that, we will stay in that undertow, have a little repair, go back to the undertow, have some repair, go back to the undertow, have repair. And if that's been your experience in yoga and you're sticking with it anyway, I say amen, hallelujah. I'm so glad you're sticking with it. There's benefit to your tenacity. So look at the aspects of your commitment, not just where I'm saying, we should have cleaned that up. Look at, oh, you came back, and you came back, and you came back again, and you're still coming back to your mat. But now let's see if we can change the orientation to first tend to the yamas, and to really take the yoga of that very sincerely. This, I think, is harder than the downward dog pose. To practice the yamas in a highly ethical, ongoing, sincere, heartfelt manner is harder than practicing downward facing dog. It involves others. No, of course your life involves others all the time, but you can feel a little insular during your downward dog pose. So the first of the yamas is called ahimsa in Sanskrit. The letter A means the absence of, and himsa means violence. So the absence of violence, ahimsa. Which is not the same as to say kindness, though that's it's on the spectrum. The absence of violence is more demanding, a higher caliber practice than just kindness. The absence of harm. How many of you know when you're doing something self-harming? Mm-hmm. Those are probably kind of minor self-harms, I'm guessing. Maybe like a little too much Facebook, or more sleep than you need, or going to bed too late, or less hydration than would be helpful, or maybe sometimes a food choice that isn't really great for you, or you're eating in the car while you're driving, and you know, like, this isn't the best yogic diet I'm having right now. You're sipping your khichdi through a straw in the car. I'm not recommending that, by the way, just pointing to. It's hard to get khichdi to go up a straw anyway, but, you know, like, I don't think you're like at the lowest end of the spectrum for self-harm is what I'm saying. But you raised your hand that you do know when you're doing self-harm. How do you know, and how many of you are willing to say, that you're sometimes harmful towards others? Like you're a little less kind than you could be, or you might not be as thoughtful as would be helpful, or maybe sometimes you miss somebody's facial expression when they're asking for help and you're preoccupied, or you say, I don't quite have the time. Or you may even go so far as to have really unkind thoughts about the other. And sometimes people actually raise their voices at each other, like in an angry sort of manner.
Yeah, especially after a few glasses of wine.
Yes. That's what wine does for you?
Yeah, especially if it's the other person that's instigating an argument, it can get heated. And I've learned, especially after yesterday, to cut it out of my diet. That's what I'm deciding to do.
To cut the wine out of your diet.
To cut the wine out, yes.
Yes. Sounds like good strategy for you.
Or limit it to half a glass.
And out of half a glass, can you keep with your limits?
that will be the struggle.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Changing a pattern of behavior is really where we see the Yamas and Niyamas on the road, like rubber on the road, to actually change the behavior pattern, which includes, in this case, what Dell's talking about, it includes a substance ingested in a certain amount of quantity, changing a relational dynamic. And it sounds like the other person instigates Dell.
Yes. Yes, the other person does.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But then you've got to decide, there's that factor. Do you run with this argument, or do you just let it roll off your back? And it's hard to do when you've had a few.
It's hard for you to do when you've had a few, Yeah. You offered two options there. One is go with it because it's happening. The other is let it roll off your back. And there's a middle path that yoga might recommend, which could be kindness, compassion, tenderness, recognition that you're now two people in the human dilemma. And see what's next.
I'm going to work on it.
Okay.
What's that?
She said, then you don't have to give up the wine. Thank you, Bonnie. So, yeah, when we get to the other yamas and niyamas, you're going to hear me talk about tapas, saucha. So ahimsa, I was saying, I find it to be one of the most difficult if you're really going to practice. It's not the same as in kindness or compassion. Those are definitely wonderful life values and important qualities to cultivate. But the concept of ahimsa kind of precedes the need for the kindness or the compassion because you haven't invoked the harm. You haven't yielded to the violence. It also implies that we have to acknowledge our instinct for violence, for interspecies violence. That it's in there, and part of why it's in there, I was talking about your top-down, bottom-up processing earlier today. Part of the instinct of why it's in there is a protective mechanism. So your limbic brain goes on alert when you feel, I shouldn't say feel because it happens before you have an emotion. It is your emotional brain, but when your brain perceives a threat, that part of the brain that goes on alert that says, I have to protect this human being. I have to preserve this person's biological organism so that he or she can go on preserving the species. I'm going to do that right now by causing this person to fight or flee. And fight would be an instinct that includes some measure of violence, potentially some measure of harm. But flee can also. You think you're stepping away or you're fleeing from, but the other person's experience of rejection or abandonment is also painful. So you get stuck in the swirl of the human imperative to be attached and feel connected and safe and not to know what to do when things feel turbulent or chaotic or distressing. So when your brain has produced that biochemistry for fight or flight, you're already in the swirl of what we would call himsa, the possibility of actually expressing violence or harm. So ahimsa is like a commitment that you're making, knowing this thing about the human condition and my brain as it is and other brains as they are. Knowing this, how do I choose to care for the possibility of my brain being more towards empathy, compassion, context, perspective, more equanimity? How do I care for my brain to be in that state so that in the likelihood that I'm going to get triggered, which will probably happen to some of us before midnight tonight, I'll be triggered. In the likelihood that the trigger happens, I have more leadership over that instinct. And I'll be the person who's less likely to cause harm to self or others. This is a significant undertaking to know how your system operates as an organism and then to know how you operate with your conditioning in mind. The way that we chose to defend ourselves in early life is still quite likely in operation now. We might look more grown up now. I'm glad for that. But sometimes that grown-up disguise is really hard to explore and be curious about, because it looks like it's working. Are you following okay what I'm saying? That's all right. So ahimsa is the first of the yamas, and it's really where it's the starting place to say, like, how do I want to be in community? How do I want to be held by community? What are my responsibilities to this, so that I produce the likelihood of supporting other people's awakening as well as my own? And ahimsa was Gandhi's personal choice for his yama, for his life path. He also chose satya, which is the next of the yamas. So we go from ahimsa, which means non-violence, non-harm. We go to satya, which means honesty or truthfulness. Sat is the root word for truth. So truthfulness in speech and thought and action, but also living sort of in accordance with the higher truth. Not the petty so-called truths that come up in gossip. He said, she said. But living in accordance with the higher truth of recognizing each person's indwelling nature and their potential. To live in relationship to that is also a big undertaking. We have to stay in the larger view of who each human is that's crossing our paths, rather than collapsing into the smaller view of how they're either not meeting our needs right now, or they're rejecting or abandoning us, or they're not living according to our standards or our values, so we reject or abandon them. So to stay in the constancy of seeing the true nature of the other, that's also a huge undertaking. And to reflect on what Barbara said earlier, it will lift you out of the mired experience of self-rumination, of preoccupation, perseveration. To meditate on that indwelling presence. So how do you put that then into the actual experience of relationship and community? What are you speaking to when you're going to speak the truth? How many of you have been to Brighton Bush Hot Springs? Yeah. So I of course lived there for 4 years, a long time ago. I left in 1996 to teach yoga in prison. I went from paradise, as they said, to prison. And this is not to be disparaging about Brighton Bush. I'm just speaking about my experience of living in community at that time at Brighton Bush. But we had a culture that we had decided we're going to speak our truth. I've said this to some of you before, that in that culture, speaking our truth meant me telling you what's wrong with you. It meant me telling you the ways in which you're not living up to community expectations. It kind of meant me trying on, speaking my truth, which is I'm having these feelings about your disappointment as a person. Sometimes it meant saying what's going on with me, but it was usually tied into a conversation that a person had to say the phrase, I'm just speaking my truth, within a conversation in which it wasn't really their personal vulnerability and transparency. That was obvious when they were authentically, vulnerably sharing. It was when they had to say, I'm just speaking my truth, that we knew we'd gotten into you're defending yourself in relationship to the other. So the phrase was getting misused. Do you understand what I mean by that?
It went back to himsa.
It went back to himsa, yeah. When we were young and naive as a community, and we didn't really know, we were trying it on, and a book came out while I was living at Brighton Bush called Radical Honesty. Does anybody know this book? Brad Blanton. Is that his name? Brad Blanton? Yeah. Radical honesty, that was a good idea.
No filters.
I mean, kind of an elegant idea for the person who has the skill to do it and the maturity to understand it. Otherwise, it could be radical chaos. For honesty is really difficult. I don't mean honesty in the muddled sense of that in relationship, but to come to your ability for honesty about your vulnerability when you've experienced loss or discord, that's big, really big. Yes?
Sorry for the interruption. It's very applicable. I've been battling a migraine all day, and I think I just need to go. And I'm sorry
Yes.
to leave early, but thank you.
I'll see you in the morning. Yeah, I'll see you in the morning. Good. Thank you, Amalia. Mm-hmm. So just to take the first 2 yamas as your practice would already be a significant undertaking. And let's say that you were practicing at that level in your relationships, your speech, your thoughts, your actions, your decisions about how you nurture your body. Is it himsa or ahimsa? All of that which is encompassed in that. When you then get to your yoga mat, you have a lot less tension in the system to deal with. And you experience the asana as a catalyst for what unfolds next. Now I will name the other yamas and niyamas for a moment. I just wanted to mark that. If you were living in accordance with those values and precepts and practices, when you come to your mat, the physical aches and pains, the digestive distress, the headaches, for example, as Amalia just said, the nervous system dysregulation, a lot of that would be much more elegantly operating. And then asana would be like the boat that carries you to the other side, into pranayama and then pratyahara. Well, since most of us are not experiencing that elegance in our lives in an ongoing way, let me tell you what the other yamas are and what the niyamas are. So we also have in the yamas, we say, the ethical responsibilities to others include brahmacharya, asteya, aparigraha. So let me explain, I'm going to translate in English. When we talk about brahmacharya, brahma means divine and charya means wheel. So we could say to walk in the circle of the divine. To walk in the circle of the divine. If you translate this classically, as in classical yoga, it meant celibacy. But you guys are contemporary and urban yogis and yoginis, so I'm going to give you a little gift. And I'm going to translate brahmacharya to mean clear relationship to your vitality and the vitality of others. So you're not messing with it, as it were. Clear relationship to your vitality and the vitality of others. We are of many diverse ages in this room and different life experiences. Let me ask, has anybody found that you got into a relationship based on hormones and then you regretted it later? That hasn't happened to you? So brahmacharya would be like preventing that kind of distress, that kind of upheaval. So ancient ancestor yogis, they lived shorter lives than we live. The life spectrum was shorter back then, and you can imagine they also had hormones, and that they lived more in study mode. They were sannyasins. They weren't householders in the same way that we are. We're called householders. So they may have navigated this more skillfully by practicing celibacy, but that's a decision, like a black and white decision, an all or nothing decision. And as I said, you guys are urban yogis and yoginis and contemporary as well. So if we cultivate a relationship to our sensuality and our sexuality that's for the enjoyment of and the awakening of each other, and we are honest about it and non-harming about it, it can be very useful. It's a high practice. There was also a time, I've been in the yoga community for a long time, so there was a period of time in a system of yoga that I was associated with where we had been studying one kind of philosophy and now we're going to do tantric philosophy, and it was like all about indulgence of all kinds, and that was when I started backing away from the community because the indulgence wasn't coming from a place of inner supervision. People got very messy with it. That's not brahmacharya. So when I say skillful relationship used for the purpose of awakening, for more love and clarity and harmony in your lives, use it wisely. Use your chakras and your sexuality and sensuality really wisely. Don't disguise it with overindulgence that becomes messiness. And then it starts getting justified, and so on.
Seems like a lot of spiritual traditions have all kinds of different relationships with sexuality. You're kind of looking at the priesthood and the church, the attempt at celibacy kind of just comes out in another way, kind of a perversion, or kind of, you push it down here and it comes out over there. And even in my old yoga community, it was kind of, celibacy was certainly a choice a lot of people made and a lot of people attempted to make. personally is something I tried to do. But the only thing that I realized, there was a period of time where we did an early morning training, and every morning at like 4 a.m. or something we trained weeks and weeks and weeks. And for the first time in my life, the sexual desire was completely gone, or kind of transmuted, I guess. And I think it's kind of an interesting thing, because it can't just be like you shouldn't do it, but I think truly, my experience, it can be transmuted, but it requires kind of full commitment as well. So it's really hard. I think it seems like it's either black or white. It's really difficult to manage that gray area.
Yes, yeah, and so sometimes you go on retreat, for example, even if you're not a monk or a nun, when you're on retreat, they ask you to be celibate, because they're trying to lessen the distractibility of all that material. But if we were taught, and I don't think some of the traditions have encouraged this, but if we were taught how to make wise use of that energy in our system, for, you said transmuting, we might say making good, elegant use of the inherent sexuality in the human body, we might be able to make amazing things happen with that energy. But what I've seen in my lifetime as a person on the path of yoga, and prior to that, Vipassana, is that we were recommended during retreat, don't do it. And then you go back to your life, and there was no education about how to integrate that. It was partly because the systems that I had found my way into weren't adhering to including the practice of sexuality in the system. So we're sort of left to explore on our own, how are you going to bring that into balance and make wise use of it.
Yeah, even I was reading an interview with the Dalai Lama, and somebody was asking him about that, and he's somebody who's been celibate his whole life, and he was kind of saying, well, he's like the last person you should ask. He has no idea.
He's honest.
Right?
Yeah.
So it is. It's kind of a really, that communication gap, I think, is really interesting and difficult.
Yes. Yeah. And I think when it's not wisely navigated, the shadow elements can be very painful. I mean, you end up with ahimsa and satya falling to pieces, and also asteya falls to pieces. I'll talk about that in a moment. So each of us has to ask the question. I mean, right now we're living in a yoga culture where it's not really talked about as, I mean, in yoga studios we don't want to say the word brahmacharya. And people stop coming and they don't want to pay for drop-in classes anymore. Like, oh God, I'm not doing that. That wouldn't sell very well, and so on. But we aren't talking enough about it. Like, where does that fit into your life, and how do you work with these energies? One of the primary things I can recommend if you're just beginning to look at those energies is, when is it profoundly distracting to you? When it is distracting like that, how does it manifest? Is it longing, grasping, aversion, dysregulation? Is it fantasy and daydreaming? Where do you go with that? And how might you come back into relationship with it as an innocent and natural expression of nature through your own body? Adding substances to the mix makes it more complicated. To study what your experience, study is a Sanskrit word here, I mean like svadhyaya, to study your experience of it. I don't mean study like be too analytical. But adding substances makes it very hard to be clear. Add the substance of alcohol or marijuana or cigarettes or coffee, and it's very hard to stay clear with this other major substance in the body called the hormones. Yes. I think we're relatively young as a culture, so we also don't have a lot of experience talking about sexuality and making better use of it. We're kind of young as a species, too, for that matter. And the species has an imperative that we keep replicating. So it wants you to have sex, and lots of it, just to up the chances of offspring. I mean, I'm speaking kind of casually here and pragmatically on the biological imperative of the human species. Please procreate so that we keep existing. That's what part of your brain is saying. How much leadership does that part of your brain have? By the way, it's in the limbic and lizard brain that you're compelled for that. So be wise in your relationship to it. Thank you, Nate. So asteya means non-stealing, or the absence of stealing. You could translate at a high level, it means not taking that which hasn't been given to you. There's a lot given to us very generously and freely from life and nature and from the teachings that are available and from each other's goodness or kindness. But it actually means not taking that which hasn't been given to you, which is a careful kind of thoughtfulness about even something so simple as borrowing something off the front desk here at the studio and asking, oh, wait, it wasn't given to me. Now, of course, we have a very generous studio, and you're welcome to borrow a pen off the front desk. But if you were to translate this and live it as a precept, not taking that which hasn't been given you would mean not picking up the pen off the front desk and walking away with it. It's also the practice of not taking somebody else's energy from them or taking some knowledge that they've given you and misusing that. Like not taking something personal they shared and then saying it, let's say, on social media. It means not dampening somebody else's fire if they're celebrating, not taking it away from them. And in the tradition of monks and nuns, it meant that you were nourished by whatever people were able to offer you. And the tradition of the begging bowl is a part of that you were supported by your community and they made offerings for what you would eat on a certain day. You weren't taking food unless it was offered to you. Do you understand? This is it's like very high practice to actually put it into your life. Sometimes I watch the driving community here in Oregon, and I'm from New York, so how I learned to drive there had, as I said earlier today, quite a bit of riffraff involved. I learned a lot about the world from the back seat while my father was driving. I learned that other humans are generally speaking idiots. But the word starts with an A, not with an I. And I learned that other people are in your way. And they don't know what they're doing. And you have to get around them. Now. By making a big exclamation of it. That's how I learned about driving. And so when I watch the driving in Oregon, I sometimes see in the sweetest moments, like if you're going to get on the Ross Island Bridge at rush hour, it's one zipper at a time. People are letting each other in right there. Like, yes, oh now it's you, and they're just zippering right along to cross the Ross Island Bridge from the west side to the east side. Tremendous. Lovely. But some local Oregonians have said, well, lots of other people are moving here from other parts of the country and the driving is changing.
That's true.
Be careful because, is it Rob?
Oh, yeah. I'm just going to school in Canada, actually, from the States. So, they have not followed drivers.
Yeah. So what I've seen more recently, since I'm an Oregonian now for almost 20 years, since 1993, so more than 20 years, I see aggressiveness on the freeway, and it baffles me because I see the sweetness in the neighborhoods, but I see the aggressiveness on the freeway, and I think that person is risking other people's safety and security, and they feel they have the right to do it. I would not call that asteya. They are taking something away from others in the roughness and the risk of their driving. They're taking away, let's say, our sense of safety or equanimity. Mm-hmm. Don't let them also steal your well-being. Do not damn them as they drive by. Don't condescend them. No need to swear at them. They can't hear you. Don't let them then steal your own well-being when you're in the car and you see that behavior. What you can do right there is say, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. You practice metta or mayatri to them. May you go in peace. May you and all beings everywhere experience joy and harmony. May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. That's to free you, and also, since you can't change their behavior from your car, it's to say, don't let them steal your equanimity. Yeah, be careful when you're driving. Don't let them run into your car, of course. No. And then apadigraha means non-grasping. Apadigraha, non-grasping. So like non-accumulation of stuff. Non-grasping, non-holding on. Not getting stuck in the residue that your life is generating when you're in your conditioned mind. not grasping for what others seem to have, and not accumulating material possessions beyond what's needed. When you went to India, Rob, did you get to go to Gandhi's Smriti? It's in Delhi.
No, we were only Chennai. We go 10 days in Kerala.
Oh.
So, yeah,
Nice, yes. I think, Elena, you've been to Gandhi's Smriti in Delhi, right?
Yes.
Yeah, has anybody else been to the memorial for Gandhi? Smriti means remembrance. It's the place where they're remembering him. You can see his footsteps and so on, and you can see his glasses and the simple cloth that he was wearing. You can see these are his worldly possessions. So when we say aparigraha, it means not accumulating, like not having all that stuff. The storage unit phenomena, for example. The basement of stuff. The attic. Your Christmas ornaments from 40 years ago. I don't have mine, I just have one. Just kept one. But it means not accumulating, not grasping, not holding on to that stuff. So it's like lightening the load. And it means in the physical sense that when you practice that, even in the physical sense, you are practicing it in your mind and your heart and your life. So that's like rehearsal in the material realm for what happens then on the yoga mat and in your yoga practice. So those are 5 yamas. In another Dharma talk, I'll give you the other 5 yamas, which are not a part of the Yoga Sutras, but go beyond that to a different text. And they're taught by my teacher. I learned from this teacher who lives in Mysore. His name is Shankarnarayana Joyce. If you're from Ashland, you've probably heard his name because when he visits the States, he goes to Ashland and also to Portland. We call him Acharya, so you've heard the name Acharya from some of the teachers down there. Acharya means beloved teacher. It's not specific to Dr. Shankarnarayana Joyce. It's a word used in the tradition. So this is 5 yamas in the classical translation. Then there's 5 niyamas, starting with saucha, which means cleanliness. And that implies that when you come to your life, what you put into your body and how you care for yourself, but also cleanliness in thought and speech. When I was a kid, I was prone to opening up whatever yoga books were available in the library. There were only a couple. And one had Swami Satchidananda, or some version of a man like that. I was like 6 years old. He had a long beard and he was wearing a loincloth. And he was making a string go up one side of the nose and then the other. And he also was having a cloth, like, to do the cleansing. I was so excited, I showed my parents, who were terrified. And then I showed my grandmother because she was visiting and she was more terrified of this. Here's, look at this cool thing, right? And these aren't really good photographs, but he was kind of hairy and he was doing yoga poses, and I just thought it was so cool. So I was like, and the book seemed kind of oversized, but I was maybe 6 or 7, so it might have looked bigger in my memory now than it was. So I was fascinated, and it always said in these books, the other couple books I could see. And then I saw Richard Hittleman's 28-Day Guide to Yoga when I was in high school and college. Do you know this one? Mm-hmm. Richard Hittleman, the 28-Day Guide to Yoga.
I was in college also, was my introduction.
So she was wearing the little leotard, and she had the tights on that covered the feet, and she was the yoga model, and I think she was in a black background, so it's kind of hard to... Sometimes it looked like she was floating in space doing a yoga pose. And all these books said, do not practice yoga in the hot sun. Take a shower before practicing yoga, or bathe the body before practicing yoga. They're talking about saucha as one of the responsibilities before you practice asana. So don't practice in the hot sun in the middle of the day. I don't think Bikram read that book, by the way. I think he missed it. And what's so funny is Elena can say, because she's been to the north of India, I don't know if you experienced this at any time when you're in India, but there isn't really any such thing as hot yoga in India. There is cold yoga. It's frigidly cold in the north when you're practicing yoga in the morning. We were wearing every article of clothing we had to put on to go do the yoga. Like, it's not hot there when we do yoga. So Bikram is telling you a story when he says, well, it's hot in India, so we have hot yoga here in America. I don't see any Indians practicing yoga in the hot sun in the middle of the day. I do see them practicing yoga in the early morning where it's quite cold. And they're dunking in the Ganga River where it's even colder. And they're coming out on the bank of the Ganga doing the sun salutations to warm their bodies up. They're doing cleansing practice right there on the river. So Saucha is cleanliness. And as such, it's also how you approach your asana practice, to have it be for cleansing. And that's followed by Santosha, which means contentment. This is not an easy practice for Westerners, contentment. Contentment is one way to kind of level the playing field of mayhem in your own mind. When you're caught in what are the hungry ghosts of grasping and aversion, to try right there practicing contentment. Slice through it, as they say, use the sword of discernment and come right to contentment. Is it possible to experience contentment in the here and now, in spite of the hungry ghost of aversion or grasping? Contentment without comparison. Like sometimes in the West we feel we should feel more contentment because other people have harder lives than we do in other countries. The trouble with that thought complex is that it's true. Other people have harder lives than we do in this country. But it's not recommended to look for the justification for your contentment. If you want to use the word radical before some of these words, contentment would be a better one than honesty. Radical contentment. Not in relationship to somebody else's suffering more than you are, but contentment for the practice of contentment. Sometimes in the morning, I've said this because we're working on it at my house, my stepson, I can make the kitchen sink pristine. The night before, when I go to bed, all is well. The scrubby stuff, like this, looks great. In the morning, I'm going to get up and make some tea, some chai, and I'm going to have the kitchen counter is clean. It's going to be so nice. Might be a couple cat prints on the counter, it's okay. But I wake up in the morning to the dirty dishes that happened while I was sleeping. And they are filling the sink, and there's crumbs on the counter, and there's ants crawling over to the crumbs. And say, what is my choice right there for contentment or discontentment?
Be content with discontent.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one, yeah. Yeah.
You could be content because you have them in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you're doing justification for contentment. I am contented to have them in my life. And a few crumbs is minor in that regard. Mm-hmm. So we can go back to ahimsa and satya, to see the inherent indwelling goodness in the other, to see also that his context and perspective are still developing. His neocortex isn't done. He hasn't lived on his own yet. He hasn't had full responsibility for something like this yet, and so on. So context and perspective come from this part of the brain. So if I go to ahimsa and satya, ahimsa is nonviolence to him and to me. Here's the circumstance. Somebody recommended that I put all the dirty dishes in his bed while he's sleeping. No, I didn't choose that. No. And then I work with my contentment practice right there. It's good. Jason gives me a chance to practice yoga in the kitchen first thing in the morning. Yeah. Uh-huh. Following contentment, we have the practice of tapas, which is interesting that you'll go from santosha, contentment, to tapas, which gets easily misunderstood. So let me translate. Tapas means discipline. It also means the practices of purification, and can be translated as heat, which I might say is the heat associated with the practice of discipline. I like to talk about discipline like this. When you rub two things together and you get the friction of that, you also get the heat and the possibility of transformation or purification. And the two things you're rubbing together are the way things have been and the way things could be. as you commit more to the practice of yoga, the way things have been, your conditioned mind, your thoughts, your habits, your behaviors, and so on, and the way things could be, if the Yamas and Niyamas were fully expressed in your life. So the friction between those two things is the friction between the parts of the human system that want to attach, connect, and belong and feel safe, and the part that wants to express itself uniquely and experience self-realization. This dilemma, if you ask me any question about any of your dilemmas in life, personal or interpersonal, I will be able to point you back to the dilemma being about attachment or individuation, connection or your differentiation. There's always the ongoing undercurrent of dilemmas. James Hollis says it a lot, and he says it more widely and better than I do. He's a Jungian psychologist. It is that friction that each of us faces in life, and between what has been and what could be. Sometimes what has been feels so familiar that we're pulled back to it. And what could be represents the unfamiliar and the unknown. Even though ancestor yogis are saying this is going to be tremendous. It's awakening itself. It's like love and expansiveness. This is where you're meant to be, even though it's said in the text. We still can feel timid of that great unknown horizon. So we end up falling back to what's familiar. And many times in the years that we've been gathering like this, I hear from students who are either younger students or young to the path of yoga, and they say, but I'm outgrowing some of my friendships. I'm about to outgrow this relationship or that community that has this behavior or this shared activity. They say, but I'm outgrowing, and so they're in the friction. To stay committed to the path of yoga right there is to stay committed to ahimsa and satya and asteya and brahmacharya and aparigraha and saucha and santosha, and now you're committing and the friction is causing your life to be transformed. Are you one of those people who told me you were outgrowing relationships? Yeah, it's just you're like transfixed on me. It came to be that you outgrew some relationships, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it will come to be inevitably that even if we outgrow in the temporal sense here, the path of yoga lets us look much more kindly on all of our human relationships, past, present, and future. And we might outgrow the proximity of some connections, but people can still be held in our hearts. It's like brahmacharya, choosing with whom are you spending your time and your energy and how. So tapas includes that question. And it includes just the daily discipline of getting up in the morning at, let's say, Ayurvedic optimal time and having your practice and staying committed to the process. I used to say this, I'll tell you a little story before I finish the Niyamas. I used to say, because I practice yoga at 5 a.m., this is my favorite time of day for yoga practice, 5:30. Even when I was post-car accident, post-hip surgery, post-failed hip surgery, post-hip replacement, I was still practicing at the same time of day because, well, I had it available. Particularly when you're home from surgery, recovering, you have the time available. And there could be countless distractions. This has been 25 years of yoga practice, so at first there were not email distractions. There was no email. I don't really know how to use Facebook, so that's not one of my distractions. Even historically, there weren't I didn't have internet distractions because I didn't have internet, and I didn't really have it in my home for a long time. But the distractions I could have were like the cats, the dog, the dust bunnies on my yoga mat, the stepsons, and so on. Like these sort of mammalian distractions. And so I learned to do a certain rhythm in the morning, satisfy the other mammals, go to my yoga mat. The boys aren't awake, neither is Jay when I'm practicing. But right now, my senior kitty is in hospice care in our home, and she has been my morning yoga practice. It takes her 20 minutes to eat food off of my finger. And if I felt I should be on my mat instead, I'd be in rigid thinking about my tapas. But I have a lot invested already, many years in my yoga practice, and this is my yoga to make the slurry of canned food and get it on my finger so she can get it off of my finger into her mouth. Whatever time is left after that activity is my yoga practice. And right now there's more restorative yoga in my practice than active yoga, because I'm also preparing myself for the loss. That unconditional love from the pets is like, it's one of those heartbreaks we know when we adopt them, that it's quite likely. But there's something so profound about holding her and the unconditional love that she offers without cognition. I'm also willing to feel the sorrow and the fire of loss. I know it's a part of our human experience. We get to know it. She doesn't have any idea. She's not thinking about it. She has no preconception. She's not planning anything. She's not going through memories. She's not saying thank you and goodbye. I am. So that's my yoga practice in the morning, in the early morning. She's also getting medicated with her food, so this is the tapas right now. Fortunately, I leave a big window for yoga, so I still have quite some time to actually be on my yoga mat. And she's been doing shavasana inside my Baddha Konasana, my Supta Baddha Konasana, which is quite nice. She's doing the shavasana. You know, shavasana means corpse pose. She's practicing. She doesn't know she's practicing, but I feel. So you go like this for Baddha Konasana, and she's sleeping there. And sometimes in shavasana, when I'm in Baddha Konasana, I kind of zone out, and then I come back and I think, is she still breathing? Did she go? And I check, and she's still there as of this morning. But I'm practicing like consciously with her right now. And there will be tremendous sorrow out. You know, the feelings come when they come, and I've had my big tears about it many times this week already. So. But that's tapas, which I translate as self-nurturing discipline, which means the discipline needed to nurture your yoga practice and your life. And that's followed by svadhyaya, which means to study yourself, which is not the same as endless journaling. Though I think journaling has its place, studying yourself is not the same as endless documenting of your life in journals. Self-study, by the time we come to it here in the Yamas and Niyamas, self-study is like self-accountability, self-honesty, self-introspection, self-tenderness, self-empathy. It's all those qualities. I mean, to practice that towards yourself, to practice any one of those things towards yourself is a big gift and a difficult practice, a worthwhile investment. But svadhyaya also means to study the texts of yoga, the actual written stepping stones that are provided for us, and to have some faith that those stepping stones will make sense even when applied to our lives. You see it working in somebody else's life, right? We see it in our teachers' lives. We see it sometimes in the more senior students' life. We hear anecdotes about how it works in people's lives. And svadhyaya says, let's study how that's going to work in our lives and put it into action. And then we come to Ishvari Pranidhana, which means to surrender to the manifestation of God known as Ishvara. So you spend all this time developing your yogic precepts, and then you hear the 10th one is now surrender. Along the way, the practices are also creating self that's more humble. And so when you come to surrender, it actually feels like the most natural next thing to do. You make your commitments, you have your practices, you generate a clear mind and heart, and surrender comes next.
Would you say it's kind of like after you've climbed the ladder to the roof, now you let go of the ladder? Is it the end of the study, or is it something you continue as part of it?
Surrender is ongoing, continuous. Yeah. You climb the ladder, you get to the roof, you let the ladder aside. Is that what you said?
Yeah, like I don't need the ladder anymore, so I don't need these yamas and niyamas. I've achieved enlightenment, so now I let go of the process? Is it the end of it all, or is this still part of this cyclical constant?
Well, my personal experience is that it's really more like a spiral like this, and different life events, different stages in human life, it requires some different things of you. I don't have a model that says you've accomplished these things and now you're clear and good to go. You can forget about the yamas and niyamas. My experience is more that they're getting integrated along the way, more and more integrated, and they no longer feel like concepts. They are a part of the fabric of who you are. But sometimes you get profoundly stressed or triggered, or like an old samskara or an implicit memory shoots up and you say, oh God, I feel like being unkind to that person. Oh, now I remember I've got a lot of years of practice, and you go to higher ground, as it were. In that moment, you have to surrender the trigger to go back to the higher ground of ahimsa. So I see it like spiraling around like that. Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's say you're practicing these things and they're woven into your day-to-day life. I'm going to name the other limbs of yoga, but I'm not going to expound on them because I want to honor our time commitment. So yamas and niyamas. By the way, some people in the homeland, in India, that's all they get to practice. They don't have time for asana. They aren't going to the mountains or the caves. They don't have the luxury of walking away from a family they're taking care of and going to practice. Or they work 3 or 4 small jobs that turn into one big job to make enough means to provide for their family. So, India's infinitely crowded and very impoverished, and it's difficult life to have there. So not everyone is, in fact, very few people are practicing yoga relative to the size of the country and the population. We were the tourist attraction because we were doing yoga. we were the locals' attraction. They're watching us doing the yoga in the park. Elena and I were in Pondicherry. We're doing yoga, and the locals are jogging in jogging suits running around us. They're stopping every now and then to see that these Westerners are doing sun salutations on yoga mats in the park. And there we were, improving our health and vitality. And it's pretty rare that the general Indian family has time for that. But they are practicing a lot of bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, where they have the murtis. This is a murti, the statue you see over here. They have the murtis and the rituals, and they give thanks, and they're practicing the yamas and niyamas as best they can. They might not have a formal asana practice, but it has not been highlighted in the same way it has been here in the West. So you have yamas and niyamas. The third limb of yoga would be asana. Hopefully you get to your mat and you're not bringing the pig pen riffraff with you. I mean your personal riffraff. Asana prepares us for pranayama, which is the practice of regulating and elegantly relating to the breath to create states of consciousness, awareness, to quiet the mind. Sometimes it's fun to talk to. One of my colleagues is Neil Pearson. He's in Vancouver. Do you know Neil? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he likes to talk about the O2-CO2 ratio and how that changes the brain state and the body state for chronic pain, but also for changing it towards awareness. And so there you are in pranayama, changing your CO2-O2 balance. And sometimes, as we practice bandhas, for example, and pranayama with inhale or exhale retention, you are literally changing the pressurized system on the inside, and you experience in the aftermath, in the echo, a moment of lucid clarity. Whoa. And right there, all the senses get pretty still and lucid. And you're experiencing pratyahara. You're kind of on the cosmic byways right there. Tomorrow when we practice pranayama with my friend Chris Canaris, you'll experience the taste of that again. So pranayama is a tool, a practice, a science to help us move to the next limb of yoga, which is pratyahara. Translated classically, it means to withdraw your senses. I'm going to translate it for you to say, make wise use of your senses. The sensory cortex in the human brain very quickly sends messages to other parts of the brain. So if you have 5 senses taking in information from the thalamus to the amygdala, you can either go quickly into what's called the low road, where your hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals go on alert. Or you can cultivate a relationship to your senses where you go to what's called the high road, where your neocortex is more present than your frightened brain parts, your limbic and lizard brain. And you can rest in the experience of the senses. Sometimes I say to my students, we have a meditation called, it's for the senses, we say, I'm not now seeking the pleasant, I'm not avoiding the unpleasant. There's nothing to do, nothing to undo, nothing to want, and nothing missing. It's like a pratyahara meditation. We do it for each of the senses. You can say to your eyes, to your ears, like this, we're not now seeking the pleasant, we're not now avoiding the unpleasant. There's nothing for us to do, nothing to undo, nothing to want, and nothing missing. And we're telling the senses, it's okay, you can relax. Because your senses were imprinted, they were offered to you from your system to spare you from being eaten by a tiger. They were offered primarily for your survival, not for your spiritual awakening. So you have to have a little more leadership over the senses, not them having more leadership over you. Like we say, you can't ride two wild horses at once. My teacher Saras, who's in Chennai, Saraswati, she likes to say of the human mind, when the senses are out of control, she says, it's like a drunken monkey stung by a scorpion haunted by ghosts. Do you remember? Elena, when she said that, do you remember? The drunken monkey stung by a scorpion haunted by ghosts. That's when the senses are out of control and the mind is too. So we practice asana to get the body regulated, to practice pranayama so we can sit well enough to practice pranayama, so we can sit well enough with our senses to experience them as a not drunken monkey, not stung by a scorpion, not haunted by ghosts, but in that lucid clarity. And pratyahara takes us very naturally to dharana, which means concentration. I think in a way we could say pratyahara and dharana, if you combine them, the current mindfulness and neuroscience community is teaching right there. They're in that spot, and they're leaning towards meditation, which is dhyana, and some of them are making use of pranayama, breathing practice. But mindfulness is right now kind of encompassing pratyahara and dharana, which means can we concentrate our attention mindfully and non-judgmentally, non-distractedly. And dharana leads naturally to the next stage, which is called dhyana, or meditative presence. Sometimes you experience that in the biochemical echo of your shavasana when you sit up, and meditation is accessible, it's easy, it's right there. You're not struggling with the meditation. However, we don't always have 90 minutes to get to the whole yoga class and then have the shavasana and the meditation, so it's helpful to know, clean up your life in the yamas and niyamas, practice just enough asana to practice some pranayama. It's more powerful than asana. Practice the pranayama to help understand the senses. Pratyahara is more powerful than pranayama. Dharana is more powerful than pratyahara, and dhyana is more powerful than dharana. The steps get stronger as you go up, and your access to those gets easier as you're climbing the limbs as well. And then we get to arrive at samadhi. Hooray! Samadhi is the 8th limb of yoga, known as realization or absorption in that infinite, indwelling suchness. It's that thing that's magnetically pulling you to come back home through yoga. It's that thing that when you arrive, you feel like you've come home. But you don't have a sense that I've done it. There won't be a big sense of self proclaiming anything. Awareness doesn't have the need to proclaim itself. It already exists. Rumi had this poem I'll say, and then we'll sit quietly for a few moments. And I like the way he says at the very end, listen to the last line, which I'll repeat a couple times. He's talking about what I'm referring to right here when I say awareness recognizes itself. And we didn't make it happen at that point. It's magnetically pulling us back home. So he said, burn yourself, strip yourself down to blind, loving silence. And then you will see you are gazing at the light with its own ageless eyes. So burn yourself, strip yourself down to blind, loving silence. And then you will see you are gazing at the light with its own ageless eyes. That's the experience of samadhi, that you are gazing at the light with its own ageless eyes. So let's sit for a few minutes of quiet together, please. When you bring yourself back into seated meditation, I'm going to recommend that you relax the mind that wants to know the material and let your body listen to tonight's discussion. No need to grasp for the concepts. We can trust that your body and your brain are soaking in the experience. You can also trust the process of yoga for your own ripening. And with appreciation for the chance to be here and the experience of each other, please bring your palms into Anjali Mudra. And ask of your body what one expression or insight you might like to sustain in an embodied sense. And pair that commitment you're making at my invitation, but pair that commitment you're making with the gesture of Anjali Mudra. Anjali means to make a forward offering from your heart. Thank you very much, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste.